Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
We're here at the University of Minnesota's Stoll Thrust Theater, where later in the month of February, they'll be staging a performance of Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera.
And you're dead.
So that's the Great Conquest? So that's the beauty of Soho? He's Mars and I am Venus, and no one comes between us, and certainly not
Kym Longhi is a senior teaching specialist in the University of Minnesota's Department of Theater Arts and Dance. She is the director of the upcoming performance of the Threepenny Opera. Matthias Rothe is a professor in the Department of German, Scandinavian, and Dutch at the University of Minnesota. Welcome both of you to Access Minnesota.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell us about the play. What's the story all about?
What's the story all about? Well, it's a love story, and it's about a bandit named Matthias, who is famed for his crimes. He's legendary in his crimes. And there are three women in love with him: Polly, the daughter of the beggar king, Jeremiah Peachum, and Lucy, the daughter of Tiger Brown, the chief of police, and Jenny Diver, the whore, who actually runs her whorehouse, Turnbridge, where Matthias has to go every Thursday because he's got his habits and he has his comforts and conveniences. So it's it's a farce. It's kind of crazy that these three women are all in love with this one bandit. He has a gang. Jeremiah Peachum is the beggar king. He has a band of beggars that he has syndicated and turned into a really thriving business. And the whole thing turns on Peachum's disapproval of Matthias' elopement with Polly. And in my opinion, Matthias elopes with Polly because he wants to increase his status in the world. You know, he wants to be in with somebody who's more up and coming, and so he marries a bourgeois. And Polly she's kind of idealistic and maybe a little spoiled and hasn't seen much of the world, and is very excited about being with Matthias, and defies her parents. And then her parents spend the rest of the play trying to get Polly away from Matthias. And the solution they arrive on is to get him incarcerated and condemned to death, which they manage to do successfully after a few mishaps and escapes and double crosses. And
I mean, ultimately, this action comedy is an allegory. So it's about the relation between politics, crime, and business, and the difficulty to draw boundaries between these different eras. I think that's also at the heart of it. And the idea of commodification, that everything can be turned into commodity, a passion, an attitude, or poverty. I mean, not for the benefit of the poor, but for the benefit of Peachum, the entrepreneur.
Why was the Threepenny Opera chosen for performance this season?
Well, there's a few reasons. The biggest question that's come out of my research as I've been looking at Brecht and different works of his and his motives for creating theater, the biggest question that I've come up with is that Threepenny Opera really asks is, what are you worth? And to who? And why? And in this society of Threepenny Opera, in this world, everything is a transaction. Everything is for sale. So ultimately, nothing really has value, or the values have really shifted. And so Threepenny Opera is this expose, really, of how these values have shifted in this world where money is the only thing that matters. And so for me, this question has haunted me of, what are you worth? Like, whose stories are valued in our culture? whose stories get told and whose stories don't, and why is that? And it does, a lot of times, it comes down to money. For me, also, Threepenny Opera is, you know, I want it to be very entertaining, and it is entertaining. The music is fantastic. You have to tap your toes to, like, the tale of Macheath and his evil deeds. And for me, that's a beautiful tension, that dialectic between being really entertained and really horrified. And the use of entertainment in our culture to basically narcotize us, to make us fall asleep to everything that's happening is disturbing to me, and I want to speak to it with this play. And so it'll be a very entertaining critique of entertainment in the end. You know, if we do our job right, and we have our work cut out for us, we'll be able to entertain the audience and simultaneously get them to really question their enjoyment of it.
The Threepenny Opera is described as epic theater. What exactly does that mean?
It is perhaps best understood if you see the enemy, which is a little a straw man, but the enemy is representational realism, where the audience is put into almost the role of a voyeur, and they buy into the illusion that what they see is happening here and now in front of their eyes. And so epic theater then literally disrupts these kind of stories. You can understand it as a disruption and as the introduction of a commentary or of a reflection on the story that the audience has just seen. I mean, the word epic comes from the literary genre of narration, so storytelling, novel. So epic theater at that time, and it was really in the becoming, it was not yet epic theater, meant something like retelling, a re-narration, a representation. So the story is disrupted and it is retold. And once it is retold, the audience can intervene. The audience is in a different position. The audience is not a passive voyeur and sees something that happens in front of their eyes. The audience can ideally contest what is said. They can come in with their opinions. And I mean, this was done, I mean, with a pedagogical, attitude in mind, but also it built on the insight that if you tell a story that just straightforwardly unfolds, then you have to blank a lot of things out. They become invisible. For example, a story about a speculator at the stock exchange, which Brecht also wrote, becomes a story about somebody's obsession and the audience is interested in him winning or losing. But what you do not see are the consequences and the effects of speculation. They are blanked out. So in order to make these consequences visible, you have to disrupt the story. You have to introduce commentary. You have to retell them and emphasizing different moments. Mm-hmm. And so this is basically what epic theater does. It disrupts, it intervenes. It does not destroy the story, it disrupts and represents it for often pedagogical mm-hmm. purposes.
So it's like when you're looking at a text and you're looking at that text critically, you take a highlighter and you highlight those sections that are meaningful or that you need to have a dialogue with in order to really learn from that text. And then you mark up the margins like crazy, writing your comments. Why? How is this possible? And Brecht is trying to do that with his epic theater. So one of his tactics is direct address. So right in the middle of the scene, the actor breaks from being the character or showing us the character into being the actor with a critical attitude about what the character just did and speaks directly to the audience, not generally to the audience, but right to someone in the audience and confronts them with the action that just occurred.
Other forms of disruptions were, for example, big posters, or that the titles of the scene were announced, or that the stage directions were spoken. So Brecht came up with a whole kind of long list of possible methods of disruptions, and this has changed throughout his work, and what epic exactly meant has changed throughout this work. But at this time that we are talking about, 1928, it was in the becoming still. There was no program of epic theater. I mean, it was forming.
How was the play received by audiences at the time?
Can I tell this one? Okay. So I kind of love this because, first of all, the rehearsal process was so chaotic. It was nearly disastrous. Several of the lead actors had already booked engagements for the following week. They already had jobs booked because they thought the play was going to open and close. And you know, the night before, they wrote Mac the Knife. The day of opening, they walk into the theater and there's this huge, crazy, like mechanical horse, and the director looks at it and goes, "What is that?" And Brecht says, "We have that or we have no play." And then the horse collapses, and so they don't have the horse, but they do the show anyway. So anyway, they're doing the play, and in the beginning, the Moritat was supposed to be sung with the accompaniment of an organ, kind of organ grinder. And the thing broke. And so the actor didn't have any accompaniment, but he was used to singing in the rhythm of this organ grinder, so it was really not aesthetically pleasing. It didn't inspire a lot of, you know, anything but questions. So the audience really sat in stunned silence for the first, like, third of the play until right after the canon song, which was the song about war, and they got it. And suddenly they like exploded into applause, jumped to their feet, and demanded an encore. And from then on, they laughed at everything, and the play went great. And they actually stood up and applauded.
And it was the most successful play between 1928 and 1933 when the Nazis came to power, the most successful play on German stages.
And Brecht hated it.
It was a must-see, and it was especially successful with all those people that he had meant to criticize.
Yeah.
So the playwright hated his own play,
Yes.
or at least how it was received.
He hated it. He's like, "I'm going to hold the mirror up to the bourgeoisie, and I'm going to say, this is how you look. Do you like it?" And they loved it. They ate it up with a spoon, and they wanted more.
Really, Tack, don't be impertinent. That you fantasize about me and that really embarrassing. That you wonder what we do. That you never even scrounge. Just imagine him with you.
Wearingly, and thank you very much.
Let's see what that looks like.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at the historical context behind Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
And now back to our look at the upcoming production of Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera at the University of Minnesota Theater. The play was written following World War I. Tell us about the social and economic conditions in Germany at that time, and how did they impact the storyline?
The period the play was written was part of the 4 years of stability that the Weimar Republic at that time knew, which from 1924 to 1928 or 9, almost 5 years. So, but of course the play is related to what a lot of people saw as a problem of parliamentarism and democracy, which was very new to Germany, and there were a lot of enemies towards it from the left and the right, namely corruption, rule only in the name of business, money is the only thing that counts. So all this, as you said, is part of this allegory, which is not set in Berlin, but it's an allegory on these experiences of Weimar, of corruption, of commodification, of instability.
Now, I loved what you said once to the students about this time, was that it was a time of crisis, meaning it was a time of great opportunity for change. And there was always this possibility of change and need for it, and yet over that, 20-year period, nothing happened. People kept expecting change, and nothing happened.
This is a very important moment, that if we hear crisis today, we think of decline and doom, but crisis was experienced as things coming to the point of decision, to the point where something new happens. And all these political activists and a lot of ordinary citizens thought that this democracy thing here that doesn't really work with all these instabilities, it is only transitional and something new will arrive. So crisis was a moment of hope for a lot of people, it was for political activists in particular, it was not so much associated with doom and decline, and then everything changed with the rise of the National Socialists. And
Right, but in some ways the problem was that nothing happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things about Threepenny Opera that I really hate as a director and dramaturgically is that essentially nothing happens. Like everything happens.
Yeah.
And then at the end, well, I don't want to give away the ending too soon, but because I want you to see it, but at the end, McHeath is sentenced to die. There might be some catharsis, and there is none. It's taken away from us with a happy ending. So I think that parallel is really strong, and it's important to me too.
Yeah, yeah.
And I look at our world, and I look at our current event situation with everything, and there seems to be a deep cry for change from lots of different perspectives. It's not just one group.
Yeah.
What were the playwright Brecht's views of communism, and how did his politics inform the play?
His communism or his Marxism was also only in the becoming at that time. He was not yet a Marxist or communist. He became one at the very end of the 1920s, early 1930s. He met a famous Marxist theorist, Karl Korsch, who was banned from the party, who did not adhere to the Moscow party line, and Brecht was fascinated by him, and they started discussion circles. And it was through Karl Korsch in 1929 that he really thought of himself as being a Marxist. So at the time the play was written, he was left, there's no doubt about it. He was politically left, he was maybe a socialist, he hoped for a new form of society, but he was not yet a communist or a Marxist. And he always remained a somewhat odd Marxist or communist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
He
always
was
a bit
dialectical.
of an outsider.
He was dialectical because, I mean, yes, he was writing plays from a Marxist perspective, but then he negotiated for 62% of the profits for the rights to Threepenny Opera.
And even these plays, like his famous didactic plays that seem very doctrinal to us if we read them, very kind of Moscow-like, are plays that were meant to be changed. They were plays that did not conceive of an audience, that only wanted actors. Everybody is an actor, and everybody was encouraged to rewrite it, to change it. So what he presented was a provocation that people had to react to. Mm-hmm. This was the concept. But if we now read a play like The Measures Taken out of context, and it looks like it was written by Stalin, but it was a reaction also to Stalin. He wanted people to change this while they enacted.
Yes.
So, and this is very often forgotten, and then Brecht is put into this box, and I think one needs to remember that it was a pedagogical project that was fundamentally open.
Yeah, I think his work is all about what can you teach the audience. So this is a question we have in rehearsal all the time, is not just what is this scene, what happens, how do you feel about it, how should the audience feel about it, but what is it teaching us about our world and our society? But as a teacher, for me, it's much more powerful to teach through questions than it is through proposing answers. And I think that what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do with Brecht as a director, is to bring out the questions, to provoke the audience to question, and to have to go home and think about it, maybe not get that answer right away, so that it becomes a process that they're working on long after the play is over. For me, a really powerful thing is this idea of Marx and historical materialism, and how he really looked at history from the viewpoint of economics, and how by doing that, you could really start to lay bare a lot of power structures and to really make those structures that are invisible visible. And you spoke about that earlier, but I think that's a really powerful thing that an artist needs to do. At least from my point of view, as an artist, that's what I want to do, is take those invisible structures and help the audience to see them more clearly. And there's so many things that distract us. There's such a gloss on our lives. And how can the artist creatively provoke questions that help people to analyze those structures so that perhaps change is more possible.
What does the play tell us about how political ideology reflected in art impacts audiences?
You know, I tell my students that theater is political, even if it's not trying to be political, even if there's not a political message. Anytime you get up in front of a group of people and command their attention and express some point of view, that's a political act. And I think one of the reasons, too, that Brecht was really resisting the hypnosis of theater, or the hypnotic possibilities of theater, is that politicians can be very hypnotic. And, you know, the audience, if they're not trained to question, so like trained to look at themselves differently in this arena, then, you know, it's very easy for people who are hypnotic and charming and charismatic in whatever way they're charismatic, and we know of some in our culture right now, it's easy for them to be manipulated. And Brecht was, I think, really trying to help the audience to be critical and not.
Yeah. And this theater can be, I mean, it can be adapted as a method, and it has been adapted. Brecht is so successful worldwide. I have a student in my class from Iran. She just told me that he is really, really big there, translated in Farsi, all over the place. University of Minnesota Press sold a lot of rights to African countries. So it's really all over in India, everywhere. Brecht is used as a method in political struggles. So his theater has proved as enormously useful. I mean, it's difficult to point to individual impacts, but yeah.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at the music in Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now a look at some of the music from Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera being staged at the University of Minnesota Theater. Tell us about the music in the play. Was the use of jazz somewhat unique for musical theater at the time?
It was unique for opera. I think that Kurt Weill really wanted, both Brecht and Weill wanted to do something revolutionary. I think that Weill wanted to revolutionize an aesthetic, and Brecht was using aesthetics to try to revolutionize a society. And so in some ways their aims were similar, but in some ways they were divergent. But Weill wanted to make opera more accessible to the masses. And so, yeah, he went for it. He created new forms, and he borrowed from the jazz tradition, and some of the music sounds like klezmer music or what was happening in the clubs.
I think this is important. It's not just jazz. He borrows from that tradition. He also uses very classical themes or folk songs. And as much as there is and was difference between Weill and Brecht, where they met was disruption, this principle of disruption. And this is what Weill did with the music. It's dissonant, it's disruptive, and it very often introduces a kind of sinister bend to what we see on the surface as being just comical. So it's a meta-commentary. So it's not just jazz. Jazz was very, very popular at the time. America was very, very popular at the time. But this is more than just jazz.
Work was artistic. Seems that Mackie was nowhere near.
Someone's lying by the TV.
One of the most famous songs in the opera, Mac the Knife, has been performed by numerous singers over the years, including Bobby Darin, Frank Sinatra, and Ella Fitzgerald. What made this song so endearing outside of the opera itself?
I mean, I taught in class a couple of these versions. I looked with students at a couple of these versions. And students that only had known it in German before, and when they heard the English lines, they were kind of shocked. And they told me, this is such a harmless song. You want to go like this, and you want to sing along, but this is about murderer, this is about rape, this is about And I think you said this earlier about the tension between kind of entertainment and critique
horror,
and
yeah.
horror, the way it is. This is in a very genius way done in this song in particular. And I think this makes part of its fascination. Yeah.
Someone robbed her, someone raped her, someone's flick knife did the rest. He's a rapist, he's a sadist, and they haven't caught him yet.
How have the theater students involved in the opera responded to its themes?
They really are passionate about a lot of these things. The violence toward women and sexual exploitation, that gendering that happens in the play, and how it's exposed, and how do we expose that. They're looking at the political manipulation of the masses, and they're thinking about Trump. And they really want to actually get the audience to be more involved. And so they've been brainstorming ways to do that. One idea was that they want to label the audience as they come in and give them some sort of price tag or label so that they know how much they're worth, and that when they're interacting with the audience, because there will be lots of interactive moments, that they'll treat audiences according to their label, to the value that they have. Another thing they thought would be great would be to make a signboard that the audience could write their protest or their response to the play, because they really feel it's important for the audience to respond and not just to take it in and applaud.
Kym Longhi is a senior teaching specialist at the University of Minnesota's School of Theater, Arts, and Dance. She is also staging and directing the upcoming performance of the Threepenny Opera. Matthias Rothe is a professor in the Department of German, Scandinavian, and Dutch at the University of Minnesota. Thank you both for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Yeah.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.